I'm doing great.
Everyone good?
Yes. And you?
Yeah, very good, thank you. It's a little bit early in the morning, but I'm usually here quite early, so in the studio. So.
Anyway, thank you very much for joining us early morning from UK and share about your practice with me and with my classmates, with my students, and also many participants who are joining us through the Zoom meetings.
Fantastic. That's great. And Phoebe, you're a media artist too.
Yeah, I am.
Fantastic. And I was just looking at your work about the moon. That was really interesting. Great, really nice.
Yeah, I have a lot of questions want to ask you after the talk, because I think that there's a lot of area that we're interested in common.
Yeah, absolutely. I look forward to the conversation. Are you part of the conversation tomorrow, or is that someone different?
Yes, I will also join the conversations for tomorrow.
Fantastic. Yeah. Good.
So do you think it's a good time for us to start the lecture today?
Absolutely. If you've got everyone you need, I'm ready to start. I'll tell you what, one thing we'll do first quickly, I just check my computer sound to check that it's playing properly. 2 seconds. Share screen. I'm just going to play some sound just to check it works. Play. I'm just looking for something to play. There we go. Can you hear that?
Yes.
How loud is it? Is that okay?
It's great.
Yeah, okay. Super. Very good. Well, I'm good to go when you are. Yeah.
So first of all, I would like to welcome everyone to join us this afternoon or this morning from different parts of the world to Jason's talk about future digital technologies. We will first start with the lecture and then later on we will follow up with Q&A sections.
Fantastic. Phoebe, thank you very much. And good afternoon to everyone there, and good morning if anyone's listening from London, which I doubt it. Yes, it gives me great pleasure to present to you a lecture around future digital art technology, and largely really looking at through the lens of looking at my own work, really, because I can talk to you about the application of technology and how I got started as well. So are you able, is my sound good?
Yeah, it's great.
Yeah,
it's great.
Fantastic. So yeah, my name's Jason Bruges. I'm sat in my studio in East London. I'm an architect trained artist and designer working with technology and media in work that's commissioned, generally speaking, and that's site specific. And I'm going to talk to you today and probably some of you again tomorrow. And today I'm going to look more at my art practice and the technology within it and how I work. And tomorrow we'll be looking a little bit more at some of the commissions that are perhaps more design led that have led to sort of work being exhibited or being used commercially, and how that works. So there's a sort of slightly different kind of bias. So you might not see some projects today, but they'll be shown tomorrow. And I have been practicing for nearly 20 years in London. And as I said, the practice is multidisciplinary. So I have a team of people I work with who are from all sorts of walks of life and professions, from scientists, architects, engineers, interaction designers, computational designers, performance artists, graphic artists, 3D designers, product designers. So quite a wide range of collaborations within the studio. My team's nearly about 30 people. Because of the size of the projects and the type of projects, I need a kind of team to collaborate with. So you'll see, I'll show you some of the team as well. So if you look on the website, it's a sort of hybrid practice. So you will see art commissions, which are commissioned by museums like this one, the Victoria and Albert Museum. This was for an exhibition called Decode in 2009, which was a project looking at the idea of how we look at ourselves, the idea of digital narcissism, and the idea of really building upon, and I'll talk more about this project later, but the practice really is grounded in experiments and process-led work. And when I say site-specific, it really kind of relates to the kind of architecture of the space. And in this context, I was working with the interior courtyard of the Victoria and Albert Museum in London. But quite often, people are really interested in these experiments. They're interested in what you're thinking about and how it might be applied to the storytelling they're trying to evoke. So I do get commissions that are design-led, i.e. there's some kind of brief, there's a story that wants to be told that's not necessarily generated by me. So, and this is a reveal space for Aston Martin. I was approached by the design director, Aston Martin, to create this space in their factory. Again, a similar sort of time to the other piece at the Victoria and Albert Museum. And this was a cloud of organic LED light that illuminated the top surface of this Aston Martin car. And a very kind of surreal space, really, a space where only 77 of these cars would get handed over to their prospective owners. This was the first time they'd ever see them. So I'm sitting in an empty studio. We are actually at about 50% capacity now, again in London, which is good. It's very hands-on work, so it's very important to be here and be testing and making and prototyping. And this is me flying a drone for our studio, so you can sort of see what it usually looks like with people in it. And we've got like workshop, testing space, lab, office area, kitchen. So it's, you know, it's a busy space. But usually I would be traveling around the world, and I'm massively inspired by places and people. And you'll see there are little red dots, and these are where we've received commissions in the past. You'll see a little dot in Hong Kong. We did some commissions with Norman Foster in Cyberport, but I'm not sure what's the status of those at the moment, and similarly in Guangzhou. But we are currently quite active in mainland China with some commissions from SKP and some of the other property developers in Chengdu and other cities. But the work is site specific, so I'm continually readjusting and thinking about the context of my work based on where it happens. So some key themes that emerge in my work. I'm very interested in systems, and whether they're natural systems, they're, I suppose, environmental systems, or how people interact with their environment. And that's probably quite big in terms of how I look at the context of things we're looking at. Obviously, when you start thinking about the context of people and their environment or natural systems, you use a lot of data, and we kind of learn about the environment and learn about what's happening around us by using data. And largely, I'm telling stories about environments or places. And as I said, it's very kind of process-led. So quite often things are explored and experimented with. So a lot of what I'm going to show you are based, things that are based on experiments and kind of thought experiments and processes. And if you were to sort of come to the studio today, one of the experiments we're currently conducting is a piece that's looking at how actually water can be used as a sort of mediated or a kind of media surface, essentially. And we're exploring the idea of self-transcendence in this piece. And this is an experiment we have set up at the moment in the studio at all different scales. And we're actually animating the surface of water and using it to sort of completely change the nature of the space in which it sits. And I've been fascinated actually about the use of water as a sort of technological interface for a space for some time. And this is an experiment that I've been working on for the last 2 years. And this will be displayed and exhibited in the Museum of the Future in Dubai at the expo there. So some of the sort of experiments, and this looks at a lot of natural systems. It looks a lot at how we describe water and how we describe its movements and how we can move it. So there's an interesting language there, but it becomes this sort of digitally controlled entity that I can interact with. People are extremely important, as I said, and I'm always thinking about, in my training as an architect, I started to think about buildings as performance spaces and places where you're watching the people and how they interact with the built environment and how buildings come alive. And so therefore I'm looking at a kind of quality of space called space syntax, which is how spaces animate people and let them move around, and then in turn how the built environment or the building can respond to them. I use a lot of sensors, computer vision, machine vision, cameras to sense space and also data as well. And this piece was a commission for the World Wildlife Fund, and just using one thermal camera here to map a space and look to see where people are. And it's based on a queuing system that you get in a supermarket, actually. So the technology was derived directly from the idea of queuing, which us Brits are sort of obviously well known for. And you queue to interact with this artwork. So one by one, people walk around it and the pandas basically stare at you. It obviously encouraging some internal thoughts about the environment, about our effect on it. And you've got this kind of matrix of 100 fiberglass pandas, which used to be collection boxes in the UK in the 1970s for the World Wildlife Fund. As I said, exploring use of data, this is a visualization, which is an important tool to explore how things might look before you've built them, of an artwork that we created for the Culture Mile, which is a consortium of bodies in the City of London. So the Barbican Art Centre, the Museum of London, the London Symphony Orchestra, the Guildhall, and the Corporation of London basically get people to think about all the cultural activities that are happening in the City of London. And we were inspired by that and looked at how we could actually create a kind of catalyst for discussion about the cultural activity in the city by creating this piece in the Barbican's tunnel that runs under the Barbican Art Centre, if anyone's been to London. And this dynamic textural piece, that's a media piece that uses physical pixels, was inspired by the brutalist architecture of the Barbican Art Centre itself, which has this chiseled and hammered concrete texture all over it. So I had this idea that these machines could travel across the surface of the tunnel, creating their own brutalist architecture. This piece is called Brutalist Tapestry. But I had to create these sketches of pieces of work so that they can be situated in environments that are sometimes quite difficult. This is on a live road. A lot of the projects quite often sit in spaces that are difficult, actually. So there's a lot of lobbying and negotiating and experimenting and testing and persuading involved in this work. And you've got to be quite strong to sort of be able to push work like this through. Similarly, this piece of work that tells a story for children in the world-renowned Great Ormond Street Hospital for Children in London, where the walls come alive. You're wheeled from water theatre. And the whole idea was to create this environment that distracted the children on their way to surgery. If you're distracted, your anxiety levels go down, the healing process is improved. So the idea was you're going through this North European birch forest, which is denoted by a half-tone pattern as a wallpaper on the walls. But coming through that pattern are these little animals, these digital animals that respond to your presence. And here I am with my two daughters looking at it and just seeing how it would look. And it comes through the wallpaper, and it's fragments of a digital surface. Now, what's important for me here is it's the combination, it's the assembly, it's the composite that's important. We can all use technology in our work, but for me, it's the combination of materials and how it sits in the environment that's really, really important. When this is off, it disappears. When it's on, it's this kind of flicker of light. It's this sort of piece of magic that transports the children somewhere else. And this work happens in the studio. I mean, as I said, a lot of it's commissioned. So we are generally starting projects based on a conversation with a commissioner or an idea. But sometimes there is some experimentation without any goals or ideas or endpoints, which is really important to do as well. Here is some work which I was thinking about floating on water, creating these organic LED water lilies, which could display information, but also take their power from the water. So the electricity flows through the water up into these digital plants. Again, the research was commissioned, but there wasn't an end product. So one of the key motives for me for creating work is about trying to improve environments. And that's obviously quite multifaceted. And that probably stems from my early work and research as an architect. And I worked for Norman Foster for 4 years on and off. And while I was kind of thinking really ideologically and from a philosophical point of view, what I wanted to do, I didn't know. But it was a really good kind of training school for understanding architecture and understanding how to persuade people to do things, but also how to communicate them incredibly clearly and how to draw them and how to engineer them. This project was a commission from Westfield, the property developer who runs lots of Australian headquartered, lots of shopping centres. I'm not sure if there are any in China or Hong Kong. But this brief was to improve and lift this sort of the external environment to the shopping mall. This is the entrance to Olympic Park in Stratford, London. I was commissioned in 2009, 2010 to start this work, and it was about creating a series of interventions that lifted this environment from another shopping mall, essentially. And I know you've got some interesting commissioners and developers working in Hong Kong that are really pushing the boundaries in terms of thinking about where art galleries can actually happen, or where cultural activities can happen in different places. And that's an important thing when you're doing situational work, sited work, is that it doesn't always sit in a gallery. So you've got to start looking at the context of where you're working. So for example, here, it was thinking about a series of pieces of work that would sit in a flow of people, but it becomes a piece of theatre. Retail is theatre. It's changing, it's very fluid. It looks different a lot of the time. But I was interested here in, there's a lot of water flowing through Stratford. The Lee Valley comes from the north of London, and eventually the River Lee and the canalised Lee, they join the River Thames. But they give that area a lot of its character. So I was thinking about how water features exist within the great gardens of like the Renaissance and kind of in garden design. And there's a whole science and history to how where you place water features, to do with physics, to do with water supplies. And I started thinking about how they disrupt space as well. So I looked at a series of actually interventions that were based on water. Now you're looking at this thinking that doesn't look very watery at the moment, but the sketching started very much in the studio, looking at how water moves and how it animates. And part of the process here was, believe it or not, building a fountain in my studio. And we were doing 3D scans of it. We were filming it from all sorts of angles, to get an idea of what sort of physics system worked within this. And, you know, you can see I'm using lots of these technologies as tools to explore ideas. They're not necessarily part of the finished piece, but some of these technologies I see as tools or ways of exploring ideas. And the finished piece of work is 12 meters high, and it represents falling water. And in the studio, we developed a type of liquid crystal. So the material you can see that's animating here is something we developed in the studio. It's a liquid crystal composite that it's a material like a very, very old calculator. You might have seen your parents, or perhaps even your grandparents, having calculators that just have an ink in them that switches on and off to display numbers. And that's essentially what we're doing here, is using that phenomena, that technology, the ability to change the amount of reflected light. And that's all we're doing in this artwork. It's changing how it reflects light. And there's a physics system which gives me a pattern which is derived from falling water, or how the physics of falling water work. Ever-changing, generative, is a closed loop, so there's nothing affecting it. It's just changing all the time. And it's kind of always different. We've got 4,500 little facets of liquid crystal hung on this structure, which is a triangular extrusion. It's triangular because it addresses each of the vistas that come up to this artwork. So you get these perfect sort of long portraits of this kind of falling water coming down the surface of this material. And at the same time, there's a sort of generative system. So it's generating in real time, and it's always changing. Nothing's pre-rendered here. It's changing all the time. And bear in mind, this was launched 10 years ago. So we were using sort of generative algorithms then to sort of generate the patterns in this work. So there's a sound field, a three-dimensional sound field, plus also falling water represented by this piece. And there's some interesting things going on here. It doesn't use very much power, which I'm always intrigued by, how to create things that are really quite light in terms of their effect on the environment. So the liquid crystal uses about 60 watts of power to generate a very high contrast representation of this water. And there was another series of interventions. We created some digital reels which flowed through the space. And this was all at the entrance to when the Olympics sort of came to London. So another little story I want to tell you, and they're all sort of little stories, was a commission for a project in Toronto. So I'm standing at the kind of top of the CN Tower in Toronto. It's a popular observation deck for looking down. So as a sort of relatively newcomer to the city, I thought I would have a look at the kind of city from above and see what it looked like. And The site actually I was working on is actually just out of view. It's where my cursor is here, but I was really interested in the way, and you'll be used to this. I mean, where I live in London, everything's 5 or 6 stories high maximum, probably lower. And we're used to sort of open spaces which don't have much shadow in them, and there's not much overshadowing. So I was really fascinated about how the city and its sort of characteristics changed based on how the shadows moved around. And that was one thing I was thinking about. And I thought, can I somehow capture or animate something using those shadows? So an initial sketch, this was, I think, a competition sketch, was an idea of these canvases that could respond to anything that was to do with the changing incident light levels around them. And that turned into a kind of prototype. So this is a sort of prototype that is using a surface that essentially is aware of people, is aware of dogs, trees, planes, anything actually that can cast a shadow on it. And this is the sort of prototype we'll mock up in the studio to understand how something might work. And let me just actually, since I'm in the studio, there's a little bit of that technology. It's sort of wafer thin, and this is developed, and there you go, piece of digital technology that allows me to create work that is responsive to shadow and light. And back over there. And I was talking about a sort of the architectural nature of some of these things. So it's all very well thinking of something that's going to stand in a context. It's in a little pocket park, so very similar to sort of some of the spaces in Hong Kong. Pocket park next to a condominium development, and this space is very, very busy. It's a permanent piece of work. It's got to last 25, possibly 50 years. So how on earth do you create work like that in this sort of context? So obviously there's a lot of drawing and thinking about the design. So what are all the elements? And it's quite interesting thinking about the elements, because you've got to think about how long is each element going to last. And so people wonder why I've got engineers and product designers on my team. It's because I'm creating artworks that have got to survive for an incredibly long period of time in sometimes hostile environments. I mean, obviously, if I was working in Hong Kong, I'd be thinking about humidity and wind loading and UV and sun and things like that. In Toronto, I'm thinking about big temperature swings, minus 30 to plus 30 in very, very quickly. A lot of salt is used to clean and de-ice the sidewalks, the pavements and the roads. So it makes making outdoor artwork quite complicated. So we actually, this is a sketch for a little prototype. So being able to draw and explain what you're thinking about making is quite important. Yeah, but we end up making these little prototypes and trying to break them essentially. It's great to try and break things because you learn really early on whether they're going to work or not. And failing is actually a really good thing to do. I like to tell people that because it can be a bit stressful, and it gets stressful the closer you are to a deadline. That's always going to be the case. But it's much, much better to be breaking things and finding things that aren't working in your studio when you're testing and thinking about it than doing it live. And that's it's just, I always want to see something. People go to, or my team go to me, we know what it looks like, we don't have to test that bit of it. I'm like, no, I really need to see it, because I the amount of times I've been on site and then I'm preempting that sort of thing's going to happen. So every aspect of something is tested. So this is a stone piece. So we tested the water jet cutting of the piece itself. There's little glass tubes that run into the piece of work. Like thinking about how long are they? What are they made from? What type of glass? There's lots and lots of types of glass. What's the detail of where the glass sits within the granite that we cut with this water jet cutting? I mean, it's, the piece is there. It's been in situ for 7-8 years now. We've had a few problems, swapped things out. It's running nicely. Downtown Toronto. It's all about this sort of connection with the place. It's all about people finding this sort of playful nature of shadows, really, within the city. And you can sort of see it in two modes there, black out of white, white out of black. And this piece, this is it on its first evening when it was turned on, and you can see it doesn't need explanation. It's to be explored. It's for the city. It's in the city of Toronto's art collection, but it's there for lots of different reasons. And it's also, there's many different subplots going on here, because I could be a one-time visitor to Toronto and be a tourist, or I could be someone walking through that space every single day, and I'm seeing how the city changes, where the shadows move, whether it's my shadow, a tree shadow, a dog shadow, a plane flying overhead can cast a shadow on the artwork. But it's sort of, still I'm exploring this idea of, this kind of idea of narcissism, this idea of reflection, this idea of people being quite fascinated by their own movement through space. And recently I created a similar version to this piece in Wembley Park. And just so you know where this is, give you a bit of context. This is Wembley Stadium, which has now got a nice this big arch, Norman Foster designed arch and new stadium, or now it's 15, 20 years old. And we were asked by the developers that this sort of grey rectangle called the Royal Route was where the royal family first entered this stadium in the 1920s. And a couple of very dingy, dark holes that exist as underpasses. And there was a development of a new hotel here, and part of the brief was to create something that would enliven those spaces. So it might sound like not particularly interesting commission. I mean, again, even at first sight, the site is this little tiny underpass here. And it was really thinking about, I was thinking about the sort of crowds that line routes when they're watching people, the sort of audience, and thinking about what if they were casting shadows onto the walls to create this secondary audience. And here is us experimenting with how the work would work. This is Unity. I'm sure quite a few of you know Unity. So we are actually testing a lot of our works in Unity and also running them from Unity projects too. So gives us an ability to sort of obviously explore in lots of ways. And what we're doing here actually, so again, the shadows are generating the content. So it's quite a clever way of working, really. People create the content for you. But we're actually using infrared shadows. So there's a bank of infrared lamps that create shadows all the way across the canvas. And these shadows are then built, played back in real time. There's echoes, there's derivatives of them. And I'm starting to pull out things off Instagram and Vimeo where people have been filming their own interactions with it. Because this is what I really love, is these kind of explorations of the work that happen. And this was the one I particularly like, just passers by exploring the work and creating their own compositions, which I think is always powerful. And for me, the work is complete where you get these sort of interactions. It's about this performance. It's about this conversation between people and their environment. And I'll play you a little film here that sort of gives you an insight into people just initially just exploring the work and how it kind of operates and what it does. And then you also will get people dancing, skateboarding, but then there's someone just walking their dog. And then the next minute it will switch because there's a crowd of people going to a football match and the place is full. So the algorithm actually looks for crowds versus single people and will do different things based on the magnitude or the amount of people in that space. So, yes. Now, I've talked quite a lot about environments and some of the stories around the work. This is a media facade artwork on Sea Containers House in central London on the River Thames. And quite simply, this piece of work is a barometer or a kind of representation of the quality of the water in the River Thames. So every day we're testing the water of the River Thames. This is a permanent piece of work. commissioned by the advertising agency WPP, and in collaboration with a charity called Thames 21, where we build an algorithm that generates patterns based on the water quality of that day. It's very low resolution. We inherited a digital media system which sat in the mullions of the building. But it's a busy waterway. London doesn't have a kind of lighting display media art like Hong Kong. So every time you do something like this, you've got to negotiate with the portmaster, the mayor, the head of the fire brigade, and all these sorts of people to say that this sort of work's not going to create any crashes or anything untoward. So yeah, interesting. So we are telling stories, but also sort of trying to sort of hook people into these sort of conversations. So I'm going to take you on a journey through a couple of interior pieces, and this piece called Diacric Mirage. And again, I suppose it's the idea that with technologies, you can also explore old technologies as well as new technologies to sort of get the most out of things. And this was a foyer intervention for Goyre, a developer in Beijing, collaboration with Norman Foster, and starting to sort of create, how can we interact with a space that's multifunctional, entrance to a convention center, conference center, hotel, restaurant, all these kind of things. And we were starting to think about something. I'm going to show you some of the diagrams actually we created, first of all, which were to do with how people would interact with something. And the idea was about growth, and I'd been interested in how plum blossom trees are used in illustrations, and started to think about whether I could create something digital. So we were looking at a sort of mapping system that could move light around a surface and create sort of branches essentially in response to people. And we were looking at kind of color, so how we create color. This is all lots of tests. So these are the sorts of tests we're doing in the studio, looking at generating colors from materials rather than LEDs. I mean, there are LEDs, but we're using the materials to create the color, which, I mean, that is actually obviously what happens in an LED. But and here you can see us experimenting with different types of diacric coating to develop these kind of flowers or these growth patterns. And this is lots and lots of different tests and experiments happening. So sort of typical day in the studio, really, where we're trying to look at different things. And, you know, trying to go, well, what's happening here in terms of, are we creating a branch or two branches, or what's the sort of typology or layout, or are we creating some blossom? So just a bit of a kind of look behind the scenes. And actually, we had a sort of pentagonal pattern, and we were realizing that actually there's some interesting things you could do with sort of a superscript over the top. Very, very simple pattern. And then how we interacted with it was explored. Actually, we used Cinema 4D actually in this context. And you can see us sort of testing the pattern and how traces of light would move through the pattern we'd created. So just by creating a click, an event, a mouse event within Cinema, we were able just to explore how we might create different patterns of growth through our pentagonal grid, a grid of pentagons. And you can sort of see the lighting effect starting to grow. I'll just jump to the artwork itself. Was a network of diacric prisms and white LED light projecting across the surface of the wall. And the person becomes the paintbrush. So your movements are generating all of the patterns. The pattern's always different. If there are lots of people, there are many branches. If there's one person, there's one perhaps one singular branch, but it's varied and different and changing. And you can sort of see it's sort of very fluid. All of that color is coming from the materials in the wall itself. So the magentas, the greens were very carefully chosen in that process of looking at the diacric coatings on the glass. Wonderful collaboration between a whole series of companies in or around Beijing and companies in London, and myself and the team, to create this piece of work. So again, quite a lot of thinking about who can make which parts of the artwork, and we don't want to ship all of this from London to Beijing. So how does that work? So there's a lot of sort of conversations and thinking about what's the best way of building this kind of work. And another similar collaboration, actually, which we've been working on the last year. This is a piece of work in a building in the south of Seoul, in South Korea, in an area called Pangyo, which is a new kind of technology district where our commissioner, Hankook Tire, basically had this brand new headquarters building, which just opened. And we were looking at this sort of arrival artwork that sort of celebrated the sense of arrival. But what I was really interested in, you've got this kind of interesting oculus, this sort of circular void in the middle of the building, and you go up through it, and you've got this kind of split level thing going on. I started to think about things that split your vision, like water, or clouds when you're in a plane, or tree canopies. When you're going up to a tree canopies, you're in different levels. So started developing this idea of this sort of digital tree canopy, which is volumetric. It's a very abstract, fragmented voxel system. And voxel, I mean a sort of volumetric pixel system. And you go up through this cloud of pixels floating in space on an escalator. Now, to explain what these pixels are made from in this artwork, here's a little mock-up. This is the last time I managed to travel to Seoul, so it was 18 months ago, and I saw this mock-up, which was led by a mock-up I'd created in the studio, and we were trying to replicate it in Seoul. We've got layers of transparent liquid crystal and edge-emitting polymers working together to create moving light and shadow patterns in the same way you get in a tree canopy. So you lie on your back and look up through a tree. You really enjoy where things just overlap and you get like the patterns of the sun and light coming through. And it was like starting to think about, well, how can we recreate that element of something so wonderfully biophilic, wonderfully sort of puts you at ease? How can we bring that into this sort of canopy, which you'll experience coming into the building? And the idea was, and this is an early prototype, so it's a bit messy. There are wires you can see that aren't hidden. Again, it's important that you explore ideas without getting too hung up with some of these things sometimes. But because we weren't able to travel, we just spent a lot of time looking at this cloud of liquid crystal and LED lit polymer through VR goggles. So the whole thing was built in Unity so we could explore the algorithms that generated patterns of movement and shadow in this tree. It's volumetric, it's layered. We've obviously got things to do with opacity changing things, but also color changing things. We're using open weather data. So we're using an open weather API. So we're aware of the amount of cloud cover. We're aware of where the wind's coming from, when we're getting gusts, whether there's any rain. And all of those things are slightly changing the textures within our Unity project. So that's all happening live. And all of that we can test within the studio because we can test it in VR. And we're also testing things in AR, but also we're feeding that data straight into our prototypes as well. So you can sort of see how the prototypes sit against the entire kind of system. I'd love to show you a video of the entire thing, but we haven't been able to get on site yet. So if anyone is in Seoul with a camera sooner than we are, let us know. And that's the view looking up. So it's sort of in an 8-story high atrium, and it works in light level. So the idea is you've got a very bright surface above, and the liquid crystal acts as a sort of something taking the light away. So you get these kind of patterns that kind of happen above you. How am I doing for time, Phoebe? Very good.
Yeah.
Okay, cool. I'll carry on. So talk a little about this sort of as something preoccupying me at the moment. And this piece illustrates it quite well. This is a piece called Variegation Index. And when something is variegated, it's to do with a pattern of chlorophyll on the leaf of a plant. So the greenness of the leaf of the plant. So if something is variegated, there's a variety. You get green and white. And the team and I, we were commissioned to create a piece of work for a building in central London, and it's an existing lobby, and it was something just to sort of create a lift or a change to that environment. And one of the things they were doing was adding some planting to that space where they were going to have a community garden. And I was kind of really interested in how plants contribute to offices and or any interior environment. And obviously there's a lot of research and thinking around kind of biophilia and our relationship with plants. And I was looking at the experiments done by NASA in the late 1970s, which were all to do with how different types of plant contribute to an environment, and the amount they remove toxins from the air and the amount they contribute oxygen to the air was studied in great detail. And I started to look at other ways we actually look at plants and understand how well they're growing. So farmers use a process called NVDI. This is us experimenting with building our own cameras which capture the amount of absorbed and reflected infrared from the leaves. And the amount of absorbed and reflected infrared changes depending on how well the plant is photosynthesizing, going through the process of turning all the ingredients it has into growth and obviously into byproducts like oxygen. So what I was fascinating about, plants obviously doing this in real time, and you can get a real-time reading of how the plants are actually occupying a space and giving feedback and also contributing to an environment. Now, I was sort of fascinated with this as an idea. So I'm going to play you a couple of little videos that show this piece working, and we have basically a data feed coming directly from the plants. We've built our own little cameras. The little camera robots are called Alan, and they are looking at 2 plants we've got at the moment in this context, and they're feeding directly into this artwork that has a dual aspect. So it means that you can see it from both sides. I can see it from one side, I see modulated light, and from the other side, I see data representation. I see this alphanumeric matrix that's representing mapping from our NVDI index. And you'll probably notice a sort of familiarity about these shapes by which we constructed these cells. And that's very much sort of based on the sort of type of cells you'll get in leaves. So the kind of shaping there is around that. Now, I popped this in this morning because I thought I'll talk about where does the threads piece of work like this go? And currently working with Colorado State University in Denver, and they've got Colorado in the Midwest of the United States has these amazing big plains, lots of agriculture, and has a history of looking at technology and agriculture. And we were commissioned to create a piece of work for a bridge that links 2 buildings. And I was fascinated, obviously, flying over into Denver. You get all these wonderful fields that look like pixels. They're like kind of little circles. And they come about because you've got these rotational irrigation systems called, what are they called? I think it's pivot or rotational irrigation systems that spin round, creating these little circles. So started to think about things that spin or things that turn to give either you bits of information or parts of systems. So this piece called Variegation Index is a sort of really thinking about, they've got experiments with the future of farming, the future of plant growth, the future of green roofs, also growth chambers. And we're kind of filming and understanding their experiments and presenting them in real time in this sort of media artwork, media architecture. So, and this is work undergoing at the moment. So these are the sorts of sketches and that show this off. So you can sort of see us just exploring how this piece of work comes to life. And this is really and some of the sort of computational design we're doing here to understand how our data could be mapped onto the artwork. Now, some of the projects are involving another interesting phenomena. So this is a piece of work called Pentagonal Portal for a commissioner who's in the financial technology world, fintech world. And we started to think about how we could seed patterns into the artwork that then and allow it to breed. So we're using an algorithm that's sort of inspired by, bottom right, you'll see a little pattern of pixels, and that's Conway's Game of Life, a mathematician that was really interested in essentially the relationship between cells in a network, and if they lived and died, they'd actually breed to create patterns. And we've created a pentagonal version of that that allows us to sort of seed patterns into our artwork and breed them. And the commissioner was a mathematician and was really interested in the code and the software actually behind the artwork as much as the physical thing. Right, so here you can see a kind of video which shows that off. Excuse me, guys, can you be a bit quieter? Sorry, the studio's now come to life, so there's people here. Yeah, that pattern is breeding and changing all the time. Now, one last thread I want to talk about today, which is sort of important in the use of the work, and I think you'll probably be answering questions about it, is one of the sort of key questions is about sort of energy use. And there's a whole series of pieces of work which think about scavenging energy from our environment, right from this sort of piece of work for a beach in Wales, which looked at the idea of creating a turbine for a sculpture on a beach. And these are sketches from that project. Through to sculptures that oscillate and vibrate. Through to projects that create a canvas that is painted by the wind. So this is called Wind to Light on the South Bank Centre in London. And this was purely a network of small horizontal axis turbines, which basically created these sculptural paintings that were painted by the wind. And this was really a kind of catalyst for discussion around the use of micro-renewables in our environment. And another project was looking at how these turbines could create a network of pixels. So this is media artwork that is only being created when the wind blows. So you can see my shadow is occluding or stopping the pixels from lighting up. And each pixel is a turbine itself, but we're able to switch them on and off. So there are actually patterns I'm switching through within the artwork. And this is only appearing when there's the wind. But sometimes people, obviously a lot of buildings now have ratings and classifications. In the UK, we take the American system lead or the BREEAM system. And sometimes people want to shout about things like this are happening. So this is a commission for a developer in the City of London, where they had a big glass case at the entrance to their building. And it was basically used as a fresh air duct. So it would be kind of highly animated by the movement of wind through it. And it became a metaphor or a for the movement of air through that building, but also therefore the kind of energy use of it. And these are all the sorts of experiments being done within the studio to explore how this system would work and the kind of sketches we would create. And we actually have to build a vertical wind tunnel to explore how this artwork would work. And you can sort of see how that was operating. And here's another version of this artwork which is using turbines. I've got a version of that here. So yeah, we obviously always engineering these artworks, and you can sort of see the onboard electronics here and the kind of turbine itself. I'm going to show a couple more projects, and then I think we'll be good to have a bit of a discussion, and if anyone's got any ideas or questions. So the last sort of type of project I'm going to talk about is some of the temporary work the studio has created and projects I've been involved with. So, which again, guys, sorry, middle of a lecture. Thanks. And this was a project on top of the Shard in London, which created a kind of conversation start around the New Year's in 2016-17. So I created a media facade on the west, a temporary media facade on the west flank of the Shard, but also created a volumetric display within the roofscape, so the top 20 stories. But this really started a kind of fascination with using light to create new sort of forms of architecture and really think about how we could use light to kind of define space, but also obviously respond to people. So sort of the idea of creating spaces using light. And this was a commission called Light Masonry for York Minster. And this was a temporary piece for the nave, the central part of the Minster. This was a 5-day long piece, which celebrated the architecture, the space, created this kind of volume which could be inhabited within this building. This was about 20 minutes long. We worked with the organists in the building to create a kind of soundscape, as well as this sort of volumetric moving light field. It was about exploring really the craft and how this space was actually built. And this sort of work was possible because we'd sort of created a version of this space within our Cinema 4D model. So that mapped onto, you can sort of see how the two were related. Another project that was temporary and leads into my sort of last project was this project for the UK City of Culture in Hull. So this is the historic kind of representation of Hull. It's a walled city, medieval, with two rivers, River Hull and River Humber, up on the northeast side of the United Kingdom, halfway between Edinburgh and London. And they wanted to transform this sort of medieval centre. And there was a rich history of technology being used by the sort of maritime guild, the kind of way of docking ships and navigating ships, lighthouses, optics. With a series of spaces we wanted to look at to create these kind of communications, these devices that would create these performances. And we were looking at basically how we could move light around the city and using potentially a cast of upcycled robotic arms. And these were the sketches that we created to convince our commissioners to go ahead with this project that explored the idea of creating these digital handshakes, this sort of movement of light around the city. And these are actually on the left here, you can see these are the actual robots we used. So they were secondhand from an automotive plant. And the initial experiments we were doing, you can sort of see how we're sort of changing the end effectors to be able to do other things, move, bounce, redirect light to create these sort of choreographies. These are some experiments we were doing. We had to create sketches to show the planning authorities what this would look like as in a historic environment. Another important part, you have to get planning. Scale drawings. We had to reverse engineer the robots because they were old and we had to work out how they moved, the size of all the parts so that we could understand how to move them. So working in Cinema 4D, we built a sort of robot model that has inverse kinetics and a knowledge of where each part of its parts are. And we were able to sort of test our ideas for these performances. This project was called Where Do We Go From Here, which was a label or a moniker given to it by the creative director of the festival. But every movement essentially had to be signed off because these are 3-ton machines working in the public realm. The sounds you hear are found sounds, so they're coming from the mechanics and the machinery themselves. Small contact mics to sort of basically scavenge little bits of vibration and energy, create a soundscape. There's artworks happen, 4 of them in 4 different parts of the city. So it's immersive, non-linear, multi-sensory, world's first large-scale robotic art installation at this scale, on an urban scale. So lots of learnings, really. Some of them are legal, some of them about planning, some of them about urban design. So not things you really think about when you're creating a performance, creating an artwork. Which leads me on to the final thing I'm going to show you. This is happening this summer, hopefully. It's a competition we won to create a piece of work in downtown Tokyo that runs alongside the Olympics. The idea, very simply, explore the sort of parallels between a Zen garden and the sort of meditative movements the monks used to generate these extraordinary metaphors for water, and also thinking about the movement of athletes that have been finely tuned and choreographed in the same way of the athletes, and bring those together. So take data from the Olympics or inspiration from data from the Olympics and create a whole new set of patterns with some gardeners that are robotic arms on tracks. So this was our sketch for the competition. 2.5 entries, we got whittled down to 13, and we're delivering this, hopefully, this summer. And we are basically using quite a few different techniques to interrogate broadcast footage and create sets of patterns, animations, algorithms, movements that will define what our version, our inspiration from the Zen garden looks like. And we did some artist impressions. We've been doing tests within the studio. So our medium here is the movement, the choreography of those robotic arms, but also obviously the materials we're using are the sort of classic aggregate. So here we're looking at different sizes of aggregate to see what the slippage of the gravel is like, what the shadows created are like, what does it look like when it gets wet. This is an outdoor installation. This is an artist impression. And these are some tests we've been doing recently. But that's all now on a boat, and hopefully I will be in Tokyo in a month's time, but it remains to be seen how that happens. Thank you very much for your time. Look forward to thoughts, questions, and other feedback. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Jason, for being very generous and share about your creative process. I know a lot of artists, they prefer maybe keep kind of like a more mysterious, like shadows about how they produce their work. And really thank you for sharing this with my students. I just want to open the sections, want to see if there are any questions from you folks. Want to ask Jason? So maybe the first question is from me. I actually, when I look at your work, I always wanted to know about your thoughts in terms of like why you decided to incorporate technologies in your creative practice.
I've always been interested in new technologies, but it is certainly a medium rather than the story and the kind of ideas come first. My father is a software engineer and computer scientist, so I was surrounded by machines and bits of paper with punch codes, and was able to tinker with computers and coding from an early age. So I suppose it was something I was used to using and wasn't really anything different. I didn't really think of it being anything particularly different. I just thought it was something you use to express yourself and explore ideas, and played games and developed simple code from a young age. So it was just part of the set of things I would use. So when I was studying both for my architectural degree and diploma, when I started to explore buildings as artworks and as performances, computerized control and intelligence was an idea that cropped up quite early on, and it gave me a mechanism by which to animate and change, transform, and architecture is quite often described as being frozen. And I was just really interested in sort of creating work that would have this ability to animate and change. And obviously that happens naturally with just seasons, environments, people, but I was interested in helping choreograph that. So I suppose that was really a key point, really. And my work in my sort of degree at Oxford Brookes was more about performance and the idea of sort of navigating the idea of people changing spaces or sort of creating some closed loop animations. And then my postgraduate at the Bartlett UCL, University College London, got a lot more into cybernetics, which is the conversation between basically humans and machines, and is all around conversation theory. So it's all around, how do we talk to the artificial world around us? And I suppose part of a bit of a precursor to interaction design, which obviously came about then in the later 90s. And so that I started tinkering with single board computers, physical computing, before we knew what it was, to explore how can we create devices, interventions, artworks, experiments that explore these ideas and add a layer of control, a layer of intervention. So then that was another part of my postgraduate work there, really informed probably currently where we are within the studio in terms of exploring our relationship with technology and our relationship in terms of creating these performances. So yes, that was probably the series of things happened. None of them particularly planned, but yeah. And I always say it's, you know, the technology is there, it's part of the multidisciplinary palette, the mixed media palette. And most people's work really is using technology, but I embrace the aesthetics and probably embrace the process quite a lot, obviously.
Thank you. So there is one question from the audience, Kenneth, and he's really enjoy your work, but he was wondering, is there any common difficulty you encounter when you are trying to combine or using technologies with the design?
I mean, obviously I mentioned that a lot of the work, I mean, large proportion of our work is permanent, or as permanent as it can be. And obviously we're working architecturally, and materials and buildings have a design life of about 25 years typically, up to obviously hundreds of years if they're historic. And you're taking technologies which actually become obsolete very, very quickly. So it's sort of trying to balance this sort of interest in technology and future technologies and the built environment and get them to work together. And that's also one of my frustrations with architecture. Was like, you know, we were working with materials and processes that are incredibly antiquated compared to what was available. And but that does bring its challenges. So how do you create work that can be serviced and maintained? And commissioners and clients are always very nervous about the application of technology to work, because in their eyes, it's the thing that's difficult to look after, expensive to look after, and also there's quite often a knowledge gap in terms of the types of people that are usually looking after the work, but may not have the training. And therefore, you've got to think quite carefully about that whole process. So very early on, there'll be conversations about, well, how is something maintained? Who's going to change that light bulb? Who's going to change that computer? Who's going to update the software on it? There might be things we don't even know about. And that's why I obviously showed you lots of experiments and lots of prototypes, because they're things that allow us to sort of fail. And that's one thing you've got to address really quickly and not be afraid of, is understanding how you can make things more robust, really. So there is a sort of some design challenges there. So yeah, I think robust, creating things that are robust and long lasting is difficult if you're working outside a gallery context. I mean, it still is important in the gallery because you don't want your work not performing as you'd envisaged. But at the same time, as soon as it's in the public realm, there's a whole host of things that are very architectural, that are very much to do with safety, longevity, ruggedness, the language of how these things sit in the architectural environment as well is critiqued.
So usually when you develop on one project, because it involves a lot of like different kind of technologies, experiments, prototyping, testings, etc. So usually for one project, how long does it take from the ideations, from the concept to the finished work?
Massive. Some of the sort of more commercial projects, the sort of exhibition-based projects and things, which I'm going to share of tomorrow, you might be able to create some piece of work in 6 months, perhaps 9 months. But that's quite quick if you're developing new work and doing research and development. And the probably average length of time for a built work that's going to the built environment architecturally, probably 2 to 3 years, because quite often you're running alongside the building. So you're trying to develop work that can make the best use of the spaces that are available to it. So, but I would say probably time in terms of non-stop time working on something, about a year, but that year could be stretched over a year, 2 years, 3 years, and longer. So it just sort of spreads to match the length of the project. We've had a project, we're working on an underground station in Toronto for York University there, and I think I worked on it start to finish 9 years. So we'd come up with the ideas, concept of the artwork, won this idea, which is all about the kind of piston effect of air moving through tunnels and creating this sort of, visualizing the sort of visible flows of things, and designed it, prototyped it, got it all signed off. And then they did all the tunneling. So it took about 4 years, some political delays, and then redid the technical design, then installed it like 8 years later. So, you know, it can be very, very kind of long. And, but that's also the other important part of sort of prototyping, testing, and doing things live in the studio means we have a sort of very hands-on approach and understanding of what things are going to work. Because you were waiting 9 years or even 3 years every time you were doing something, you'd come quite disconnected, I think, from what you're actually doing.
Yes, yes. So usually, for your work, will you think that actually you are having an idea first, and then you started to thinking of which technology is the best way to express your idea, or in parallel, some technologies you are already very interested in to explore, and then you think certain ideas actually is also a good match. So how does it work for your practice?
I'd say within my practice, within the studio, I'd say about 80% of it is ideas first, but sometimes there'll be things bubbling away that are particularly attractive or suit a certain context. But largely, it's about telling a story. Largely, it's about that narrative. It's that sort of catalyst, something there that's come from a conversation that is right about that site or that combination of criteria. But of course, there are certain technologies, approaches, methodologies that are being explored and developed in the studio. And obviously, you've seen the work with digital shadows, which is carrying on the idea of the ability to sort of create shadows and use them is really interesting. And also the work that's happening in the studio, and I'll share more of it tomorrow, where we're developing our own composites. So there's quite a lot of work we're doing with liquid crystal and other state-changing materials that are very nice and very, very stable, really interesting. And weirdly, I sort of see those processes it's sort of like different painters, really, where they've developed their own pigments or their own ways of working and then start to use them. So if you take someone like Yves Klein, who developed his blue pigment and spent many years then using it and refining it and changing it and patented it. I mean, the technologies we're working with is no different from that sort of process, really. So we're looking at certain things and then just evolving them. So yeah, very, very simple, but kind of, simple and complex composites using material, mixtures of glass and liquid crystal, and how do they create surfaces that are active and animated, but highly readable and stable. And there we're looking at, transparency, we're looking at reflectivity, we're looking at polarization, we're looking at different inks. And that's quite a long process, but it feeds into a series of ideas as well.
Right.
How many people do you have in the studio there?
We have around 40 students here.
Okay. Oh, fantastic. It's good to see you all. Thank you for your time and patience. Yeah, give me a wave. I want to see you. That's great. And lots of people online. No, it's fantastic to see. Well, I do ask questions. I mean, also, I imagine most of you, some of you will be around for tomorrow's conversation. So if you've got a conversation or you want to write it down, we send them through and I can address conversations tomorrow if you're feeling shy now. because well, I've lots of plenty of time tomorrow as well.
Yeah. Okay, so thank you very much for your time, Jason, and we talk again tomorrow. And have
Absolutely,
a nice day
looking forward to it. Yes, feel free to send me any questions. If there are any questions, burning thoughts, or particular projects that people want to see, I might cover them tomorrow. But if people want to know about anything in particular, if I get it, if it comes relatively soon or early tomorrow morning, I can hopefully sneak that into my tomorrow's conversation.
Anyway.
But thank you for your time, everyone, and everyone online as well. I appreciate it. And hopefully there's been some interesting insights and giving you some ideas or thoughts or inspirations. And it would have been very nice to be doing this in person. I forgot to add, actually, I lived in Hong Kong for a year as well. Perhaps I'll tell you about that a bit more tomorrow. Yeah, thank you very much. And look forward to seeing you tomorrow.
Thank you very much. Bye-bye.
Bye.